Okay, Kim, whenever you're ready.
All right, thanks for joining us today. Our speaker today is Lizzy Monaghan. She holds her master's from the Hawaiʻi Institute of Marine Biology, and she studied some marine microbial communities during that work. She's also been with DAR for about a year as our ballast water and biofouling coordinator. And with that, Lizzy, I'll let you begin your talk.
Awesome, thank you, Kim. I will share my screen. Alrighty. All right, I'm just gonna assume everyone can see that. Okay, hi. As Kim said, I'm Lizzy. I work on the Aquatic Invasive Species team, and today I'm going to be talking about aquatic invasive species prevention and management on Oʻahu. Invasive species are any species that are harmful to the environment, the economy, or human health. So Hawaii has a very unique environment due to its geographic isolation and volcanic origins. So new species in the past occurred here only very infrequently. However, since human history in Hawaii, species have been introduced at a rapid rate. And these introduced species are more likely to have harmful effects in isolated Hawaii because the natural species here are so unique. Aquatic invasive species, there's approximately 463 marine invasive and 86 freshwater invasive species on the Hawaiian Islands. This is probably an underestimate since we don't know all of the invasive species here. Aquatic invasive species can outcompete, eat, or parasitize the native species, and many of these species arrive in Hawaii via vessels. Since Hawaii gets so much boat traffic, they can come either in the ballast water tanks or on the hull of a vessel. Aquatic environments are difficult to study in comparison to terrestrial environments because they require training in scuba, snorkel, and other specific techniques. So when we talk about Hawaii's aquatic habitats, there's a number of unique aquatic habitats here. These include estuaries, or places where salt and freshwater mix, streams and lakes, our intertidal zone, of course, coral reefs, and our saltwater pools. So Hawaii has a lot of very unique aquatic ecosystems. So what's at stake when we talk about aquatic invasive species? Our economy is at stake, so aquatic invasive species can cause things like erosion, lower property value. They can decrease tourism by making our island less beautiful. They can also affect ecosystem health and services, so they can affect the natural ecosystem and change how things work. They can affect public health. They can cause disease in humans. They can cause injury. And then also they can affect food security here. So Hawaii, a lot of people in Hawaii are subsistence fisher people, and aquatic invasive species can affect catch in these subsistence fisheries and thus affect meals that people here eat. These are a few common aquatic invasive species here in Hawaii. There's the orange keyhole sponge, the peacock grouper, the tilapia. But when we talk about aquatic invasive species here, it's important to talk about invasive algae. So Hawaii has a lot of invasive algae. These include smothering seaweed, leather mudweed, hookweed, prickly seaweed, and gorilla ogo. And why we care about invasive algae. Invasive algae can outcompete native algae for sunlight and space in our waters. It can also cover native coral, which prevents the zooxanthellae or little symbiotic organisms that live in coral from getting sunlight that they need to photosynthesize and therefore grow. And our coral is really important here because it provides structures to our coral reefs, which then provide habitat for fish and other animals, and are important breeding grounds for our animals and areas for larvae or baby animals to grow. So this is a table of some paths or vectors of species introduction. These are a few common ones. Not all of these apply specifically to Hawaii, but these paths include vessels. So organisms can come over on the hulls of vessels as fouling or in the ballast water of vessels. The fishery industry can introduce new species through deliberate release of species to support aquaculture or accidental release. Plant introductions, a lot of common aquaria plants become invasive species because people bring them and then accidentally release them or on purpose release them. Biocontrol, animals are released in order to control other invasive species, and then they themselves can become invasive. Individual release, so people sometimes purposefully release their pets into the wild or accidentally release them, or organisms can be transported through recreational equipment such as dive gear. So if you're traveling and you bring your dive gear back to Hawaii, some organisms might still be on there. And then of course, scientific activities, accidentally or deliberately releasing due to scientific research. Today, I'm going to focus on this vector here, vessels, because approximately 78% of all marine species introductions in Hawaii come via vessel fouling or ballast water. Ballast water is water that's taken up or released to balance the weight of vessels. So when a ship travels to a port and it takes up water, this can also have larvae or even fully grown organisms in it when it takes it up. And then when it travels to a new port, it may release that ballast water and release some of those organisms. So it's important when you are operating a vessel to follow best practices. So exchanging ballast water offshore where there are less organisms in the water, avoid risky exchange areas such as coral reefs where there's a high concentration of organisms, and then also treating the water to sterilize it before releasing it back into the ocean. The other way that organisms get transported via vessels is by hull fouling. So hull fouling is when communities of organisms grow on the bottom of vessels. And this can be anywhere from anything from bacteria to entire macroorganisms. And they can grow on the bottom of vessels or in a number of crevices and things on the bottom of boats. And this vector has been responsible for the introduction of many bivalve sponges and other fouling species to Hawaii from other ports that vessels have traveled from. So what can be transported? These are a few cases that we have seen here in Hawaii of organisms being transported via fouling, ballast water, and fouling. So tunicates, crabs, sponges, and other organisms can travel this way. So what does our team do about this? So the best and most effective policy is just preventing organisms from ever arriving here in Hawaii. So we try to reach this goal in a number of ways. One way to address this vector that I was talking about is ballast water and hull fouling legislature. So here in Hawaii, we have a rule that requires vessels to manage ballast water in an approved method, and then also submit a reporting form that tells us the background of where their ballast water came from and how they manage it. So we process a lot of these every year. In 2020, we processed 729 of these forms. However, there's no current regulations for hull fouling. So when vessels travel here, there's not any regulation for how they treat their hulls. However, our team does help with some hull inspections for travel to certain areas, or if we ask the vessel and they allow us to. And a hull inspection involves us diving down and visually inspecting the hull of the ship for invasive or other organisms. Another method of prevention is performing risk assessments. So we perform risk assessments of vessels to see which vessels that are coming to Hawaii may be at risk of transporting species via ballast water, or we sometimes perform them on individual species to see what risk those species pose to Hawaii. One tool we use is this ASIS, the Aquatic Invasive Species Screening Kit. So doing these risk assessments help us initiate inspections of vessels that we think are going to be risky, or to watch certain vectors for arrivals of these species that we have deemed risky to Hawaii. Another part of prevention is doing outreach. So doing outreach lets us tell vessel operators, citizens, and scientists what to look out for in terms of invasive species. It also helps us get funding to address invasive species issues. So our outreach includes making flyers, giving talks. Sometimes we host volunteers, and a lot of other things. A current project that we have that is kind of tied to both preventing and managing invasive species is our ARMS unit monitoring project. So ARMS units are autonomous reef monitoring structures, which are basically settlement plates that have a bunch of different crevices for benthic organisms to settle in. So back in 2017, we deployed 20 of these in 5 different Hawaii harbors, 2 here on Oʻahu, and then 1 on Maui, Big Island, and Kauai. So the units are collected from the harbors after deployment, and the plates are disassembled from the settlement structure. They're photographed, sorted, and then the specimens are collected for taxonomic identification by experts in genetic sequencing. And the point of this project is to create a database of benthic species that are present in our harbors, collect taxonomic vouchers, which are basically just taxonomically identified specimens that have also been genetically sequenced. And then also to create a comparison between, we have settlement plates on the inside of these harbors and just outside, so create a comparison between the locations. So since 2017, we've collected all of the units on Oʻahu, and this has generated 131 unique species reported in this project, 157 ideal voucher specimens that have been obtained for genetic sequencing, and also 1 new species of amphipod that was described. Moving on to more management projects our team has. So this was a project that we called the super sucker barge. It was for invasive algae removal in Kaneohe Bay. The way this worked was it basically worked like a big vacuum. There was a barge and there was a system of hoses that snorkelers would manipulate around the reef to collect invasive algae from Kaneohe Bay, which was then sorted and composted to get rid of. So this project was actually put on hold after the volume of invasive algae in Kaneohe Bay decreased significantly. Another management project we have is biocontrol using native Hawaiian collector urchins. So we have an urchin hatchery out on Sand Island that grows all of these baby urchins that are a native Hawaiian species. And once they are big enough, our team of snorkelers takes them out to the reef where there's invasive algae and outplants them on the reef to graze on the invasive algae. So this helps us manage the invasive algae on the reef in a healthy way for the ecosystem. And it's very passive because we just put the urchins out there and they grow up on the reef. We also perform response and removal when we get reports of new invasive species. So this was a recent project our team did on Kauai. There was water hyacinth, which is a common aquarium plant, growing in a cistern. And our team flew out there to remove the water hyacinth from the cistern, like manually, in order to prevent it from flowing downstream into the freshwater systems on Kauai and further spreading. Another response our team did was removing non-native corals in Kaneohe Bay. So a local family reported some unusual looking corals in Kaneohe Bay that they knew from their knowledge as water persons that these corals didn't belong in the area. DAR collaborated with a number of different people, the Kawelo family, the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology, the Haiea National Estuarine Research Reserve, NOAA, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Center or Service to identify these corals as non-native and then remove them from the bay. The collected corals were then transported to the Waikiki Aquarium where they were used for display. So an important thing to remember is that invasive species prevention is an ongoing process. The Aquatic Invasive Species team is always anticipating new species that may become biosecurity threats here on Oʻahu and on the Hawaiian Islands. Two current threats that we are addressing include Chondria tumulosa, which you will hear about in a later talk from Heather, a later talk later this week. And it's a Chondria tumulosa is a coral smothering algae that has been found in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. So we are currently working on preventing it from coming to the main Hawaiian Islands. And then also stony coral tissue loss disease, which is a disease devastating corals in the Caribbean, and it causes a rapid mortality of corals there. We've been trying to prevent it from coming to the Pacific. So we help to create guidelines for preventing spread, create outreach documents, and try to stay up to date on information regarding recognizing these species and addressing them if they come here. So now I'm going to talk about a couple of citizen science programs that we have. One of these is Eyes of the Reef Hawaii. This is a website that is targeted towards recreational divers, snorkelers, and other fisher persons. On this website, you can report sightings of invasive species using a form. So if you spot a new invasive species, this is a way to report it. And then you can also take online training to be an Eyes of the Reef reporter on this website, or review your species identification so you know what invasive species to look out for. Another citizen science project that we have is iNaturalist. So this is a website and also a free app that's free to join. It's an online network of people that share information about their observations in nature. So we sort of use this to understand the distribution of invasive species. So on it, you can identify species and record the occurrence when you spot them. So if you want to join our network, it's called the State of Hawaii Aquatic Invasive Species Project on the app or the website. And then just a couple things that you can do at home to address aquatic invasive species. So just learning to recognize invasive species in your area is important. So then if you see something new, you can report it, or you can participate in these citizen science programs that I talked about. Checking your recreational vessels and equipment for invasive species after you use them. There's certain invasive species that sometimes occur in some bays on the island and not in others. Or if you're traveling, it's really important to check all of your equipment to make sure you're not spreading any invasive species. And then cleaning, drying, and disinfecting all equipment after you use it in water, especially if you're going to transport it to new water to use. And then, of course, never release your pets, your plants, or your bait into the water. Be a responsible pet owner. So with that, here are some resources. This is our website that we have all kinds of information about aquatic invasive species on. The two citizen science programs that I was talking about, iNaturalist and Eyes of the Reef, and then my email if you are interested in asking more questions. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you, Lizzy. I think that we can open it up for questions. So I believe you can put some questions either in the chat or the Q&A, just the written questions. Okay, I guess we'll just give it a couple more minutes just in case someone does have a question. Okay, we have a question here in the chat. Are dogs invasive? From what I heard, when we let them swim in the ocean?
That's a good question. I don't think we would count dogs as an aquatic invasive species. And also, I don't think that we would count them as an invasive species since they are domesticated. But perhaps feral dogs. I guess there's probably some feral dogs on the island. We would count them as invasive.
Yeah, I think also from what I've heard, it's important, like they can be vectors of disease potentially through their waste. So it's important to pick up after your dogs. But actually another terrestrial animal that does affect our aquatic life are cats. So I believe there's a talk later in the week on toxoplasmosis and cats. You can just go ahead and check out the schedule for the rest of the week. I'm going to post the website link in the chat.
Yeah, and your dog can definitely be dangerous to the wildlife here. I know it's always recommended to keep them away from like any aquatic mammals, things like that, because they can stress them out or even harm them.
We have another question in the chat. Are there ways to volunteer to do aquatic invasive species work or to learn about different lemurs?
I know, so this month is the month of the lemur, right? Is there any kind of training that people can attend? Do you know, Kim?
Well, so it's actually the year of the lemur. So lemur are native algae, whereas we like to reserve invasive algae for the invasives because they're not supposed to be here. But Kua does a lot of work with lemur, as well as Malama Mauna Lua down on the south shore of Oʻahu. So sometimes there are times when you are allowed to do some restoration. Also, there's some great opportunities for this month in particular on the website as well to volunteer. I think there's several like marsh and estuary restorations going on later this week. So you should definitely go ahead and check that out. Okay, looks like that's the end of our questions. Great talk, Lizzy. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who attended, and aloha.
Thank you.